Night fell heavy over Harper's Ferry. It wasn't just darkness, it was the kind that felt like it had weight, that made your breath come shorter and turned the woods around the Shenandoah River so quiet no teenager should even notice. But they didn't notice. 8 teens were hiking up the trail, laughing loud, beer cans clinking in backpacks and hands. One of them was filming on his phone, the flashlight barely steady, showing nothing but trees rushing by. Luna was in the back, as always. She looked too worried, thought too much. Her friends called her paranoid, but she saw everything. The damp shine on the tree trunks, the bats cutting through the sky, and, for a moment she never told anyone about, crows flying across the moon in silence. The rest of the group didn't care. They were too excited to think about birds or bad signs. Ben, the loud one, carried 2 bottles and laughed hard, nudging Neil, the shy one who barely talked. Ivy, always the skeptic, made fun of everything. Marcus, the clown, cracked jokes about every rock on the trail. Tasha, the leader, guided them like she owned the night. Ellie and Josh, the couple, walked hand in hand, sneaking quick kisses, not caring about the others. At the end of the trail, the outline of the old house appeared, damp ruins, dark bricks, a mouth opening into nothing. No one had really used the place in a long time, except for kids like them. The woods had swallowed half the structure, but the other half still stood, with wet walls and a broken roof. "This is it," Tasha said, triumphant, like she'd found a castle. They walked in laughing, kicking empty bottles that were already on the floor. Their phone flashlights swept across walls covered in graffiti. The damp air clung to their skin. Luna took deep breaths, trying to ignore the knot in her stomach. Marcus spun a bottle on the floor, laughing. Truth or dare? They sat in a circle, their own voices echoing through the dark gaps. Bottles and cans around them, like some silly ritual. The first rounds were harmless, teen stuff. "Is it true you kissed Ivy behind the gym?" "Dare, drink straight from the bottle." Laughter burst out, teasing little confessions. The phone kept filming, shaky like one more memory to be embarrassed about later. But the drinks started bringing out more courage than they should have. The dares got bolder. "Go down that hallway and take a selfie alone. Kiss the person to your right. Turn your flashlight off for a minute." The flashlights trembled whenever someone walked away. Nervous laughter followed when they came running back, saying they'd seen a reflection or a shadow in a photo. Then someone said, "Touch that rusty iron on the wall and make a wish." The chosen one went over, stumbling over rubble. The phone's light happened to catch an old bell, big, blackened by time, hanging from a beam in the collapsed ceiling. The boy walked past it, touched a rusted bar on the wall, and ran back. Everyone laughed. Marcus, laughing harder than he should, shouted, "Dare! Ring that old bell at the end of the hallway." The room went silent. The chosen boy, drunk, stood up. "Fine, I'll go." The others cheered him on. "Go, Ben. That's it." The hallway ahead looked like a tunnel with an open mouth swallowing any light. The boy stepped into the dark corridor. He reached out his arm, took another step, and then a scream. "Ah!" Something yanked him into the dark. Like an invisible hook had caught him. His scream ripped through the room, sharp, real, a sound none of them would ever forget. A cry of pure terror came with the harsh scrape of fingernails clawing the wall, dragged inward, until the scream vanished into the corridor. The circle of teenagers exploded in chaos. Flashlights swung, lighting up falling dust from the ceiling. Doors slammed on their own. The air felt colder. "Ivy!" Someone shouted, but she was already screaming, her throat wide open in terror. Ben ran for the exit, but the hallway swallowed him just like the shadow had swallowed the other. Neil fell, and something unseen dragged him across the floor, leaving deep marks in the dust. "Guys, help me!" Tasha shouted names, but her voice was lost under another sound, a warped, awful laugh echoing from above, as if the ceiling itself were breathing. Luna didn't think. She just ran. She stumbled out, hit the rubble, tore her hand on rust. The taste of blood filled her mouth. She turned just in time to see, in flashes of light, 7 silhouettes being pulled into the dark. One by one, they were swallowed by the creature. She ran through the woods, branches slashing her skin, tears blurring her sight. The town below looked like another world. Calm lights, peaceful, as if nothing were wrong. She reached the road, stumbling, almost falling. A pickup truck screeched to a stop just a few feet away, tires screaming. A couple jumped out, eyes wide. The woman grabbed Luna by the arms. "Oh my God, girl, what happened?" And Luna, mouth shaking between sobs, could only whisper, "My friend, they were taken. Please help me. I think they're dead." The next morning brought light, but no peace. Harper's Ferry isn't a big town. It's a peninsula between two rivers, with narrow streets that wind down from the hills to the water. Old houses sit close together. There's a square in front of the church, and trails disappear into the woods just above the dam. The way the land is shaped makes the town feel too small for so much commotion. Anything out of the ordinary spreads like wildfire. Word spread fast across the sidewalks by the square. An older man found a dead bird on the church steps. Across the way on the main street, a flock of birds started falling onto the hot asphalt, wings flapping with nowhere to land. People stopped, stared, took pictures, and recorded videos on their phones. Many sent them to friends or posted straight to social media. At the corner market, the talk ran low and tense. Folks whispered about the falling birds, the missing teens, tossing around guesses. Some clammed up and said little. Others helped explain what they'd heard. Farther out by the Shenandoah River, someone walking by filmed a school of fish floating at the surface, bellies up, scales shining like dead metal. A voice in the video said, "My God, look at this." The clip spread through the town's networks like wildfire. By that afternoon, everyone had seen the same image. A police officer drove by slowly, taking notes, a frown on his face. It looked like no one had an answer that made sense. A newspaper vendor shouted the headline like he was tossing fuel on the fire. "Mystery or ritual? 7 teens vanish." The headline went door to door. In the church hall, a few people whispered, "This feels like witchcraft." At the market, only vague, hushed rumors. Had to be the Hargrove kids. Those Hargroves are always up to something. A group of older women sat on the market steps, trading stories they'd heard from their parents about curses and old punishments. One of them whispered, "My grandma always told me to stay away from those woods." While folks argued and speculated, strange signs kept showing up around town. In James Porter's workshop across the way, red water came out of the faucet, thick, heavy, smelling like blood. A neighbor turned on the tap to wash dishes and nearly fainted from the smell. The news made its way to the school, and teachers shut the classrooms early and sent the kids home. An old man hunched over by the riverbank muttered that he couldn't remember anything like this in all his years. In the residential neighborhoods, mothers pulled their kids inside after seeing dozens of crows perched on rooftops, like they were watching everyone. The mood started shifting into controlled panic. The sheriff, a man mostly used to breaking up bar fights and land disputes, asked for calm, called for volunteers, and warned everyone not to drink tap water until further notice. Phone calls came in from the county and the state, and someone suggested bringing in specialists. The local radio went on air with the most practical theory: possible chemical incident, and the word echoed through homes like a warning, though it didn't always bring comfort. On some street corners there was fear, on others disbelief. A woman knelt by the riverbank and began to pray, hands clasped, voice low. That was the atmosphere when Steve and Joanna Myers arrived. They introduced themselves to the sheriff as FBI agents and said little else. "How many missing?" Joanna asked, her voice firm. 7. All from the same high school group, the sheriff replied. "Last known sighting, time and place?" Steve pulled out a notepad. "The last one was at an old house out in the woods around midnight," said the sheriff. Trying to break the tension, Steve nervously tossed out a quick joke. "If it turns out to be just pollution, I'll eat my boot." Joanna was jotting down times, riverside spots, and small marks on rocks looking for patterns. Not to make claims, just to record the facts. At the hardware store, an older man spoke of old stories. That the woods held secrets, that healers were hunted there in the last century. One woman shook her head and said it was nonsense. Another swore she'd heard laughter at the ruins where the teens had been. The sheriff listened with a serious face. Steve and Joanna listened too. They collected interviews and timelines, logged witness accounts. They asked the lab to fast-track the water analysis. Someone handed Steve a clip of the falling birds video. He watched it in silence, face unreadable, then filed the footage in a folder. As he jotted down names and addresses, a local woman, arms crossed, said out loud what many were whispering. It must have been some witchcraft from that Luna girl and her friends. Joanna leaned in slightly, her tone serious. "Who's Luna? Where is she now?" Joanna asked. The woman wiped her hands on her skirt, eyes wide. "She was with the others, a young girl, lives near the old trail. She was the only one who came back, showed up running down the road, scared. They said she was taken to the municipal hospital, completely in shock, couldn't talk right. I saw the girl, dirty hair, cut hand. She kept saying something about an old woman at the ruins, but her mom wouldn't let anyone near her." "Did she say what she saw?" Steve asked. "Not much, she was in shock. Just kept repeating that she and her friends saw a shadow, that the darkness took them. Her mom said Luna only said she ran and never looked back." Steve and Joanna exchanged a glance, packed up their notes, and headed straight for the hospital. Quick pause before the next spell. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, now might be a good time to do it. They say the witch in this case has the strange habit of turning curious people into frogs. Not guaranteed, of course. But are you willing to take that risk? Legend has it the only spell to protect against this is simple. Subscribe to this channel and ring the bell. Do it now, while you still have legs, not paws. On the way to the municipal hospital, Steve and Joanna saw a dome swallow Harper's Ferry. It wasn't a flash or a boom. It looked like an invisible curtain dropping from the sky, sealing the town like a heavy lid over a pot. A police cruiser tried to take the main road out, sped around the curve like always, and its bumper smashed into something invisible, crumpling on impact. The driver went pale, hands shaking on the wheel. People ran over, pushed, pulled the car, but it wouldn't budge. It was a wall no one could see. Right after that, cell phones started glitching, radios gave off static, and calls simply dropped. Communication turned into noise no one could decode. Joanna took the little bag of salt from his hand, tossed a handful into the air, and said quietly, "It's a dome. It cut off our signal and access to the outside. We're trapped." In another part of town, the dome sliced a cow in half. The barrier wasn't superstition. It was something solid. Authorities tried to keep panic under control, but it wasn't easy. The sheriff climbed onto a crate and called for calm, but his voice didn't reach everyone. Stores shut their doors, windows were locked, neighbors pushed furniture up against the glass. Then came the crows. First, they landed on wires, on chimneys, like they were settling in. Within minutes, so many had gathered on rooftops it looked like a moving shadow. The sound of their wings filled the streets with a steady hum. Then the attacks. Low flights, beak scratching, people running with torn clothes. These weren't hungry birds. They dove with purpose like they were following orders. On 2 streets, an old man was knocked down and had to be dragged indoors by neighbors. On another, a teenager was pecked in the face and bled. Panic took shape. With all communication cut off, the town had to improvise. The sheriff set up checkpoints, internal evacuation routes, and designated safe zones for the elderly, women, and children. Up to that point, there was still nothing the Myers siblings could do. They had to understand the situation. They needed to speak to Luna immediately. When they finally reached the municipal hospital, Steve and Joanna identified themselves at the front desk and asked for the room where the young girl, Luna, was staying. The nurse, her hands shaking, pointed to the hallway on the left. Her mother looked at them with a mix of fear and hope. In the room, Luna looked thin, her hair tangled, a bandage on her hand drying to a dark shade. Her eyes had the look of someone who had just barely come back from the edge of something that couldn't be explained by logic. Steve walked in without ceremony. "I'm Steve Myers, and this is my sister. We need to hear what you saw. Take your time, from beginning to end." Joanna stayed by the door, right at the threshold, present but without crowding the space. Luna spoke softly, like she was repeating something that burned inside her. She told them about the game, the dumb dares, the cold hallway, the figure at the end, the shadow of an old woman standing still, Marcus getting closer and being pulled by something. She described the sound of fingernails scraping the brick, the sharp scream that filled the room, and then her friends being swallowed by the dark. She talked about a large bell hanging from a beam, rusted, almost hidden in the back of the hall. "Nobody rang the bell," she repeated. "I swear I didn't touch it." She described its location in detail: the beam in the center of the hall, the hallway to the right of the main entrance, the broken floor, wooden debris covering part of the ceiling. Steve asked technical questions: who went into the hallway at what time, who regrouped afterward. Luna said her friends' names through sobs: Marcus, Neil, Ben, Tasha, Ellie, Josh, and Ivy. She told them how she ran, how she fell onto the road, how she was found and brought to the hospital. The words came out short, raw. Joanna listened without touching anything, just storing every sound. When they left the room, the siblings had the trail's map drawn clearly in their minds. Despite the dome and the chaos, it felt like they finally had a fixed point to focus on. It wasn't final proof, but it was a solid lead. And with the town sealed off, with communication dead, with crows filling the sky, the urgency only grew stronger. They would go to the house in the woods, and before something, whatever was behind this, could finish its grim calculation of deaths and silence. Steve and Joanna followed the trail alone, carrying flashlights, machetes, iron rods, and bags of salt in their backpacks, moving in silence toward the abandoned house where Luna had said the bell was. Steve and Joanna entered the house alone, 2 points of light cutting through the gloom. There was no one else there, just rotting wood, the low creak of the floorboards, and a smell that mixed mold, iron, and incense burned long ago. The hall at the back opened like the mouth of a cave. In the center, hanging from the beam that crossed the ceiling, was the bell, exactly where Luna had said. It was large and heavy, made entirely of iron, darkened with rust, with nails driven into the metal, as if someone had fastened things to it that should never have been. There were blackened cords, small pouches with scraps of cloth, and nearby animal bones, strands of hair, wax casting shadows like the flicker of a candle's tongue. Everything was laid out carefully like a table set for guests. On the walls, scribbles, markings that looked like tallies, little X's next to names. The bell gave off a bad feeling, a cold, metallic weight that promised things they hadn't yet imagined. Joanna stood still, the beam of her flashlight trembling slightly in her hand. "Offerings," she said flatly. Steve stepped closer, tossed a handful of salt into the air near the edge of the bell. The grains hit and bounced back like they'd been thrown against stone. A physical sign. The dome responded, and the ritual objects reacted. "It's an anchor," he said. They searched the floor carefully. Beneath a loose board, among charred pieces and ash, Steve found what they were looking for: stuck together pages, remnants of paper with scorched ink. Wearing gloves, he pulled out what hadn't turned to dust and read the markings under the shaky flashlight beam. There was one phrase, almost whole, that made Joanna's stomach turn cold. December 6th, St. Nicholas Day. When the seals weaken, the doors will open. The one who frees the father of winter will receive in return the gift they most desire. The fragment fell from Steve's hand like it was burning hot. There it was, the true purpose of the bell. Nearby, another smaller note pointed out a technical detail. The bell wouldn't wake the creature with sound alone. It still needed a ritual. If spoken while the bell rang, it would summon and command some kind of demonic entity. There were shortened instructions and counting symbols: 7, 12, 13. Numbers crossed out in sequence. The page was torn, but the meaning was clear. The bell was a trigger. The ritual was the key. The two exchanged a glance. According to these notes, this creature seems to be some kind of general in a demon army, Joanna muttered. The bell would be used to wake one of the Father of Winter's generals, a creature named COMET maybe, a beast that would bring chaos from the heights of the sky. It was theory. It was fear. It was a plan. And the worst part, someone was working to release this mechanism. Someone was counting. Steve handled the evidence with practical hands. He separated the yellowed newspaper they had read at the hospital, the piece that mentioned old winter cults, and tucked it into the inside pocket of his jacket. Joanna touched the bell with her palm, gently. Cold metal, a quiet reaction. If someone speaks the ritual while the bell is ringing, or if the bell sounds when the seals break, that creature called COMET will rise, she said. We can't leave this bell where it is. There were two bad options: destroy it here in a rush and without control, or remove it until they could prepare the right, protected space, in case the bell was shielded by some kind of spell. They chose the second option. The task was brutal. Using vines pulled from a dead tree and old cloth, they made straps around the bell. Steve pulled from one side, Joanna from the other, and together they dragged the bell across the creaking floorboards to the porch. The metal groaned. The beating of the crow's wings rose like a drum. Before they could fully secure the piece, the midday sky changed color, overtaken by darkness. First, a shadow rose like someone pulling up a blanket. Then came the eclipse, sudden and total, and the temperature dropped as if the whole town had plunged into ice water. Screams echoed in the valley. Joanna looked at the bell once and said, "We have to go. Now." They dragged the bell to the car at the start of the trail, every step a battle with weight and worry. Steve managed to hoist one of the straps onto his shoulder. Joanna took the other and felt the iron cut through the fabric into her palm. On the trail, their flashlights sliced through the dark like blades. No one came to help. It was just the two of them, the bell and the forest closing in behind. They reached the car with the bell scraping the ground. It was too big to fit in the trunk closed, so they popped it open and laid the bell on its side, the metal weighing down half the car, the rest of it sticking out, resting on blankets and ropes Steve tied off with clenched teeth. It wasn't pretty or safe, but it was better than leaving it hanging from the beam in that old house. Steve thought about taking the piece to the sheriff's office, but quickly ruled it out. The sheriff wouldn't keep something like that in a public vault, and even if he did, the station was too crowded with nervous people. They needed somewhere closed off, discreet, not a building full of curious eyes. Joanna remembered the small chapel next to the church, that little stone structure couples sometimes used for quick prayers. It was rarely used, locked with a rusty latch, and had only one bench and a small basement where they stored candles and old supplies. The chapel was built with stone walls. It was the perfect place to hide a cursed piece of metal. After speaking with the priest, they parked near the chapel, dragged the bell up the muddy steps, and with more force than finesse, stashed it in the chapel basement. There were creaks and groans from the wood. The bell almost rang a dull note when it brushed a rusty hinge. They closed the door, and Steve sealed the latch with a heavy padlock they had brought. Joanna placed the newspaper clipping and a ribbon on top, as if marking the spot for herself. It wasn't permanent protection, just a safe drawer until they could melt the thing down with the right fire and a protective circle. As they stepped outside, the eclipse had swallowed the street. The Myers siblings had removed the anchor from its original place and disrupted someone's plan. The chapel felt too small for the ritual they were about to perform. Thick stone, the smell of candles and damp air, and a heavy silence made it the perfect hiding place. Steve carefully closed the wooden door, locked it, and pushed a bench against it. Down in the basement, the bell lay wrapped in dirty cloth. Black iron with nails embedded in it, smelling of dust and old wax. Joanna lit 2 candles. Their flickering light made shadows move along the walls. They opened the improvised kit they'd carried from the house: blowtorch, oil containers, bags of coarse salt, gloves, and an iron tin to collect sparks. Steve placed the charred scrap of paper beside them. The line about December 6th and the Father of Winter was too dirty to be poetic, but still clear enough to read. The words served as both a map and a warning. Joanna read the writing once, tucked the paper into her pocket, and looked at the bell with an expression that mixed fear with method. "There has to be a counter-chant," she said quietly. "If the text says a spoken phrase activates it, then a reverse tone cancels it out. That's true in any ritual that matters." Steve nodded and began drawing a ring of salt on the stone floor around the bell. He made the circle carefully, watching his step to avoid disturbing the line. Joanna drove iron rods into the floor at the 4 cardinal points, placing the bell's beam within the circle, like sealing off a metal heart. The work was methodical: pots of oil, damp cloths hung along the walls, sandbags placed near old wood. Steve set up the blowtorch and tested the pressure. Joanna pulled out a small blade, ran the tip along her arm, and made a shallow cut. just deep enough for a few drops of blood to fall onto the salt. It was an old gesture, almost private, her own blood used as an anchor point. She whispered a string of syllables in a tone too low to form any clear words. Steve watched the walls while Joanna worked the right. Her voice was low and measured, like someone reciting a law they knew by heart. She used her left hand to smear oil on small crosses on the rods, and her thumb to spread blood across the salt in key spots. This wasn't magic. It was the practiced technique of someone who had seen real rituals and knew the body could hold the world in place for a moment, if it had to. When she finished the first cycle of words, she threw a handful of salt into the air near the bell. The grains bounced back, but with less force. "It's working. A little," Steve murmured. Beneath their breathing, the bell gave a faint tremor, a shudder like it wanted to speak. Joanna kept chanting, her voice tightening now. The effort was draining her. Her pulse raced, sweat rolled down her forehead. "Hold the circle," she said. "Keep the salt line intact." The window of time they had created was small. Steve lit the blowtorch and carefully brought the flame to the metal, avoiding the cloth spread on the floor. The iron began to heat, giving off the stench of rust and blood, and sparks leapt into the salt. A metallic heat filled the basement. Steve moved the torch tip in circles, testing the distance, adjusting the pressure. Joanna held the rhythm of the chant, repeating the syllables, and with her other hand, she pressed on the cut in her forearm, letting the blood drip slowly onto the salt. It was pain as control, pain as focus. The bell began to give way, slowly and stubbornly. Every millimeter that melted dripped liquid iron onto the salt with a sound that almost cried. The blowtorch faltered, a sputter, a flash of panic, and Steve quickly adjusted the valve, fixed the flame, and kept the heat flowing. They couldn't lose the rhythm. They knew this improvised protection had a time limit. Outside, something shifted, fast. First, a distant growl, then a blast that made the candles flicker. Boom. Another impact, closer. Boom, boom. And then a pattern, pounding against stone. Boom, boom, boom. Through the tiny cracks in the basement, streaks of fire crossed the sky, falling meteors, glowing balls trailing heat and ash, all converging toward one place, the avenue in front of the church. One after another, the burning meteorites rained down on the town. The street took hit after hit. The asphalt cracked, first into narrow splits, then into large, jagged chunks, until it broke open completely, forming a smoking X. The sound of the impacts made the building snap and creak. Crack, crack. And the basement vibrated under that barrage. The moment a chunk of bell metal gave way and dropped with a dry chack. No one could say whether the sound had come from inside or out, a piece of metal breaking or the earth splitting somewhere below. The vibration shook the whole chapel. Joanna stopped chanting mid-ritual. Steve shut off the torch. Both dropped to their knees, staring at the molten mass now cooling into warped shapes. Through a slit in the door, the orange glow downtown lit the rising smoke. The X-shaped crater steamed in the middle of the avenue. A seal had been broken. Even with the bell destroyed, the explosion outside made one thing clear. It wasn't just about the bell. Hold on just a second. I need to tell you something. Every great story starts with a spark, an idea. But a lot of people get stuck because they don't know how to find that first seed. The Idea Factory is a guide made for that. It's like a creative garden. You plant a question, a prompt, and from it grows a full story. And the best part? You don't need talent, just curiosity. In the first pinned comment, there's a lesson showing how to use this in your daily life, even if you've never written a story before. If you love fiction, it's time to start creating your own. Now take a deep breath, because what's about to happen next, no one will ever forget. The city smelled of smoke and desperation. Sirens sliced through the air like razors. People were running, someone shouted for water, and the asphalt on the main avenue was giving off thick black smoke. A wave of hot air rolled in from it. Steve and Joanna left the chapel with backpacks on, eyes trained to see terrible things, but not used to losing their breath. They scanned the wounded quickly, spotted a man with a burned arm, an older woman in shock. They gave sharp, short orders. Water over there, blanket here. And then they saw it. At the top of the hill, something moving fast, slipping into the trees toward the trail. They looked at each other and did what they knew how to do. They ran after the creature. Armed with iron, salt in their pockets, and 2 pistols, they entered the woods. The trail was muddy. The ashfall had made the ground sticky. Crows screamed, perched like sentries. The air smelled of sulfur. Hunting witches is something a tracker learns early. You follow footprints that don't look human. Marks where the earth seems swept by invisible hands. Ashes that don't come from any normal fire. Steve spotted the first signs. Broken branches, a narrow groove in the dirt, ash scattered like a fire had just been put out. Joanna caught the sweet, sulfuric smell. They walked in silence, as if any noise might betray them. Even their own footsteps sounded too loud. They saw the house before they heard anything. The same abandoned house from the trail. Stained brick, sunken porch, windows half covered by vines. Outside, there were signs of ritual. Circles drawn in the dirt, carefully stacked stones, and burned herbs around a fire ring. Ropes and strips of cloth hung from the doorframe, and the wood creaked when something brushed past it. There was no light inside, only a dense silence, thick and heavy, like something was waiting and ready to explode. Steve crouched and looked at the doorway. Shallow footprints in and out and a strong scent of burnt meat, like someone had tried to cook something that wasn't food. They scanned the area, watched for disturbed dirt, then heard it. First, a low moan, then a scream that didn't sound human, almost a howl. When the witch saw the bell was gone, she panicked. She started tearing through the cabin, hands like living bones ripping cloth, throwing jars to the floor. "Where is it?" she screamed, her voice cutting like a blade. "Who touched my things? Was it that girl?" Joanna and Steve didn't reveal themselves. They waited a minute, just enough to watch the panic rise, then stepped from their hiding spot. Steve took a step forward and the floorboard creaked under his weight. The witch looked straight at them. "You," she said, and her smile was a knife. "You took my bell. You touched my things." The witch looked like she'd come from the forest itself. A shadow in the shape of a woman, hair tangled like roots, eyes scorched and wide, skin like aged paper. Steve spoke slowly, his voice like a stone thrown. "The bell isn't here anymore. We took it and melted it. Now it can't wake anyone." The witch curled her lips in a mix of rage and surprise, and the place turned into a battlefield. She screamed. The air shivered, and like a gust filled with crows, birds cascaded down and slammed against the trees. Shadows began clinging to the cabin walls, as if people without bodies wanted to come out. The fight had no beauty. It was a tangle of reflexes and pain. Steve lunged with the iron rod in hand, and the witch responded as if the ground itself was part of her. The floor buckled, cracked beneath his feet, and the air threw him forward. He rolled, hit his shoulder, tasted blood in his mouth, got up ignoring the pain and went again. Joanna threw the salt from her pocket into the witch's eyes. A rough, automatic gesture, and for a brief second, the witch recoiled, snorted, and spat a sulfurous vapor. But she quickly raised her hands and turned the air into blades. Stones flew, and a cutting wind pushed them back. Steve drew his gun as a thick shadow covered the witch's skin. The bullet tore through the shadow like a knife through hot cloth, releasing a wisp of smoke. It wasn't a clean shot, just a scratch, but it made her howl and stagger, giving them a single second to breathe and attack again. She didn't fight with claws and brute strength alone. She summoned crows swarming in the air, beaks and talons shredding space and skin, and shadows emerging from darkness with what seemed like telekinesis. Joanna grabbed an iron bar and swung, striking the shadow that came in the shape of a hand. The shadow hissed like a candle. Steve swung with all his strength, almost hitting her, but the witch turned her head and, snapping her fingers, filled the space with flying objects. A chair hit his ribs and threw him against a crate, the pain burning, and he got up, eyes brimming with tears. There was barely time to breathe. When they tried to corner her, she condensed the darkness into a push that threw them backward. Joanna, by instinct, stomped her foot and uttered mystical words into the air, a sharp command that made the wind retreat. It wasn't enough. The witch exploded in fury, a wave of shadow sweeping through the cabin. Steve took a punch that felt made of wood and wind, falling while spitting blood. Joanna ran, struck her head with the iron bar, and the witch, panting, stepped back 2 paces and stared at them as if she saw 2 living prey. They were torn, bleeding, anchored to the ground by exhaustion, but still standing. And that was a problem for the witch. The fight reached a point where there was no elegant tactic left, only reaction and response, a brutal rhythm for those who know the next mistake could be fatal. Steve attacked as he always did, hard, direct, without theatrics, swinging the iron rod, knee striking ribs, shoulder pushing weight. Joanna moved differently, more precise, using the words she had learned on cold nights and from books of magic. Their attacks complemented each other. He opened paths, she made the witch's movements heavier and slower. The witch responded with speed and strength, pure hatred translated into power. She leapt, bending light, turning stones and branches into weapons, the ground giving way in traps. When Steve landed a clean hit, the witch let out a harsh sound from her tired throat and immediately counterattacked, throwing him against the wall. For a moment, the house seemed ready to swallow all 3. Joanna screamed his name and ran. She knew they couldn't falter. Sometimes the only way to hold a beast is to pay with your own sacrifice. She took a handful of ashes from the ruin, scattered them on the floor in a short design, a reminder of protective limits, and drew the short ritual blade she carried. Without ceremony, she cut her forearm again, letting blood drip onto the hot ashes, and began chanting the counter words they had practiced before. Words she had learned from her father at the kitchen table, from old books in the library, and from nighttime research. She had repeated them until her throat knew the rhythm. Her voice trembled, but it didn't falter. Each word was a correction, a lock, a denial. Steve saw this, and without thinking, positioned himself between Joanna and the witch. A simple move, instinctual, trusting that his sister would do what needed to be done while he handled the rest. The witch heard the sound and responded with a howl. Birds swarmed, shadows tangled, and she tried to strike Joanna with the same fury. But Joanna's chanting pierced the spell, patching the tear in the air. For a second, her magic faltered, lost its grip. Steve took advantage of the moment. He ran, grabbed the iron rod, and struck the woman squarely on the shoulder with focused force. The hit was sharp. The witch wobbled, her hands trying to contain whatever was pouring out of her. He didn't stop. He knew where to hit to really hurt. On a second, more precise strike, he drove the tip of the rod into her jaw. The witch fell with the sound of a trapped beast caught in a snare. She didn't fall like a defeated queen. She fell like a surprised predator, blood and soot dripping from one corner of her mouth as she tried to speak. Steve stepped back, gasping, ribs aching. And Joanna, bent over the wound she'd made in her own arm, felt the world spin. "You stopped me from freeing the demonic reindeer COMET, General of the Father of Winter. But don't be mistaken. The first seal was broken. It wasn't just the bell that mattered. On December 6th, St. Nicholas Day, the gates of hell will truly open. And whoever frees the Father of Winter will receive, as payment, what they desire most." Those words cut through the air like a blade. They fell on them with the weight of truth. They hadn't stopped everything. There were seals, counts, something beyond a bell hanging from a beam. The witch smiled like someone who knows the end of a story, and then her breath shortened. Her eyes closed, her skin relaxed, and the witch's body collapsed to the floor. Steve stood still for a moment, watching the scene, then checked on Joanna. She tasted blood in her mouth. The lines on her arm throbbed, and she knew it would hurt. "Did she lie?" Steve asked, his voice lower than it should have been. Joanna cleared her throat, tried a laugh that sounded like crying, and shook her head. "She didn't lie," she said. The X-shaped crack in the avenue, the flames. Something woke up out there. They searched the cabin and found evidence that made her words more than a threat. Broken stones with symbols, traces of fire that weren't just normal combustion, tally marks scratched into the corners of the wood. It wasn't venting. It was confirmation that a larger work was already underway. They buried the witch's body behind the house, hands trembling, fingers aching from the effort. Across town, The shattered and confused city tried to function as best it could. Steve and Joanna then walked to the avenue with the X-shaped fissure and stopped in front of it. The crack smelled of burnt metal. At the bottom, a line glowed as if something had been burned but not destroyed. There was a hard, real victory. The witch was dead. The demonic reindeer mentioned in the inscriptions would not rise that night. But there was also defeat. A memory that caught in the throat. A seal had been broken. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. The day dawned slowly, like someone too lazy to face what they had done the night before. First came a strange light. A slit of sky opening suddenly, as if someone had pulled back a heavy curtain. The shadows that had hung over the city for hours receded in a breath. Phones buzzed, radios crackled, and then came voices again. Cries of relief, tears, people falling to their knees in the street, laughing in a mix of astonishment and release. The eclipse ended like a poorly executed trick. The dome, which had seemed like a heavy lid pressing down for hours, began to fail in pieces. A small gap here, a signal returning there. In minutes, the town began to breathe with a semblance of normalcy. Steve and Joanna heard life returning and went straight to work. There was no ceremony. Their role was basically to patch, carry, and direct. The avenue marked with an X still smoked, the cracks glowing with lines that looked burned by metal. People were taking children from shelters. Neighbors carried blankets, volunteers improvised stretchers. Steve helped lift a man trapped under debris. Joanna applied compresses, ordered 2 boys to make a tourniquet, asked for more blankets. They dictated actions, delegated, worked wherever they could. It was the repetitive, necessary work. Dressing wounds, giving short orders, distributing water, organizing evacuation routes. The city entrance was reopened with the end of the dome, and state police entered in blocks, county vehicles, ambulances, and a fire truck that seemed to appear out of nowhere. The regional FBI, which had already tried to contact the town unsuccessfully, arrived with specialists and technicians. The town, previously alone, now had outside hands helping to repair what could be fixed. There was a surprising sense of practicality. People who had been arguing for space in lines the day before were now sharing water and calm. Rescue teams set up tents, nurses improvised care in gyms, and police formed a cordon to keep onlookers away. While the city organized itself, Steve and Joanna had a moment to speak. They stood on a stairway, shoulder to shoulder, looking at the smoking X in the middle of the street. Joanna had bandages on her arm from the ritual cut. Steve held a cup of coffee. "We killed the witch," he said, without the relief you'd expect from a movie. "We got the bell, a job well done." Joanna looked at the crack. "Yes," she replied, "but we didn't fix everything." "Did you hear what she said?" Her voice was calm, direct. "The first seal has fallen." Steve closed his eyes for a second. It wasn't surprise. It was acknowledgement of partial failure. "Then there's more," he murmured. "There is." They spoke quickly. What the witch had let slip about December 6th hammered into their minds like a hot nail. It was a date, a stake in the calendar, St. Nicholas, a day that now rang as a warning. They planted the image of the Father of Winter between themselves, the name the witch had spat, and the possibility that someone, somewhere, wanted to free that thing. They didn't stay long. They had to leave before the day became a stage for reporters turning pain into headlines. When they got into the car and drove off, the last image before the road was that X-marked avenue, a smoking cut through the heart of the small town. If you've made it this far, you already know. Subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments what you thought of this story. What worked, what surprised you, and what kind of supernatural case you want to see here. And before you go, I left a card here with a video so you can jump straight to another story, one of the darkest I've ever told. Click on it, because this video will end and you'll move on to the next hunt. I'll see you there.